I've dedicated this Yom HaShoah talk to the memory of my late father, Eli. The knowledge that my grandparents and countless family members were murdered by the Nazis has long been a driving factor in my own interest in researching, writing, and talking about the Shoah. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, known to us as Uncle Joe, needs no introduction. He was a monster who murdered millions of his fellow countrymen. In July 1941, Stalin was criminally unprepared for Operation Barbarossa when Germany invaded the USSR along a 2,900-kilometer front, the largest invasion force in the history of warfare. Suddenly, Uncle Joe became our monster, our ally in the fight against the other monster, Nazi Germany's Hitler. I want to start this afternoon's talk by introducing you to 4 leading members of the Jewish intelligentsia in Soviet Russia of the late 1930s and the early 1940s. Shlomo Michoels was widely regarded as the greatest ever Yiddish actor. In 1928, he'd been appointed director of the Moscow State Jewish Theatre, which was founded in the 1920s when Lenin was still encouraging ethnic minorities to preserve their culture. Michoels' portrayal of Tevye in Tevye the Milkman, this is long before Fiddler on the Roof, of course, and of King Lear, and I remind you we're talking about in Yiddish, have long been part of Jewish folklore. Michoels was considered the unofficial leader of the Jewish community in the USSR. Yanky Fachler was a prolific communist poet and party apparatchik who published his poems in Yiddish. He would later become an informer for the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, and even when he himself came under suspicion of anti-Soviet activities, he cooperated with his investigators and denounced Jewish colleagues. Nice fella. The Jewish-Russian writer, journalist, and political thinker, Vasily Grossman, published short stories and several novels, not in Yiddish but in Russian. During the Russian counterattack after the German invasion, Grossman was embedded with frontline Soviet troops. He became a legendary military journalist, gathering material directly from the fighting soldiers. And in the winter of 1944, Grossman returned to his hometown of Berdichev and discovered that his mother had been murdered by forces of the Einsatzgruppe C and by the Polizei, which was mainly drawn from Ukrainian population. Grossman visited the fields of powdered bones on the site of Treblinka death camp, and in his lengthy report called The Hell of Treblinka, he compared Treblinka to Dante's Inferno. Printed as a pamphlet in 1945, The Hell of Treblinka formed part of the evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials. And the fourth of our quartet is Ilya Ehrenberg, one of the best-known novelists to survive Stalin's frequent purges. During World War I, he worked as a journalist and as an Izvestia correspondent in Paris. During the 30s, he became a key component of Stalin's propaganda machine. He covered the Spanish Civil War and predicted the inevitability of war between the USSR and Germany. He was so badly shaken by the Hitler-Stalin non-aggression pact in August 1939 that for several months he could only take in liquids, chew on herbs and vegetables, and he lost 20 kilo in weight. But once Germany invaded Russia in 1941, Ehrenberg threw himself solidly behind the Russian war effort as a journalist on the front. Molotov once said that Ehrenberg's viciously anti-German propaganda was worth several divisions. All four of these Jewish cultural icons were ideological communists. All four were publicly devoted to Uncle Joe Stalin. After the Nazi invasion of July 1941, Stalin quickly realized he had to woo international public opinion. And one of his tactics was to create an arm of the Soviet Union dedicated to recruiting American Jewish dollars for the Soviet war effort. And he created the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee, excuse my Russian mispronunciation, Yevreitsky Anti Fascist, you can understand what that is, a komitet. Stalin appointed the Yiddish actor Shlomo Michaels as chairman and the Yiddish poet Yanky Fachler as vice chairman. Later, Vasily Grossman and Ilya Ehrenberg joined the committee, which eventually grew to about 70 members, including the chief rabbi of Moscow, a Jewish submarine commander, sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? The chief surgeon of the Red Army, and prominent literary figures, actors and doctors. The committee had its own Yiddish newspaper, Einigkeit, Unity. The committee also broadcast pro-Soviet propaganda to foreign audiences, assuring them that there was, of course, no anti-Semitism in the USSR. Both the newspaper and the radio were cynical but necessary attempts by Stalin to counter the well-founded accusation of the very real existence of rampant anti-Semitism in the USSR. In 1943, Stalin even authorized Michaels and Fachler to embark on the first official delegation of Soviet Jews ever to visit the West. Their 7-month tour took them to North America, Mexico, and Britain. Huge crowds came to see them wherever they appeared. In the US, they were welcomed by a national reception committee chaired by Albert Einstein. Other celebrities that Michaels and Fachler met included Chaim Weizmann, Charlie Chaplin, I should say maybe Lahavdil, Marc Chagall, and Paul Robeson. The trip raised over $30 million for the Soviet war effort. That was a lot of money in those days. Yeah. On July the 16th, 1943, Pravda reported Michaels and Fachler received a message from Chicago that a special conference of the Joint initiated a campaign to finance 1,000 ambulances. 1,000 ambulances for the needs of the Red Army. As the advancing Soviet troops encountered the shocking realities of the Nazi genocide of Jews on Soviet territory, Stalin established the, and this is the full name, Extraordinary Commission for Investigation of Crimes Perpetrated by the German fascist occupiers and their collaborators. This commission ultimately collected 250,000 reports of atrocities. Ehrenberg and Grossman spent months visiting the areas liberated by Soviet troops, collecting eyewitness accounts. At the suggestion of Einstein, the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee decided to produce a black book detailing the Holocaust activities on Soviet territory. The committee appointed an editorial board headed by Grossman and Ehrenberg. The editors received details of the mass murder of Soviet Jewish citizens perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators throughout Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The material was drawn from letters, diaries, affidavits, and testimonies by witnesses and victims, and many of the letters were handed to the editors by relatives and friends of Jews who had been executed by the Nazis. The material also included articles written by Soviet authors, personal interviews with witnesses, reports written following examination of the sites of mass execution and the areas upon which the ghettos and death camps were situated, reports of the opening of mass graves, and testimony given to the investigators of the Extraordinary Commission by perpetrators. They managed to get testimony from some of the perpetrators who directly organized and carried out the murders. In the course of 1944 and 1945, Ehrenberg and Grossman produced 2 volumes under the title Murder of the People in Yiddish. So the first fruit of this collaboration was in Yiddish. Ehrenberg wrote later that the Russian State Literary Commission did not actually commit to publishing the book. His inverted commas. Instead of a straight answer, the resolution was, write the book, and if it comes out well, it will be published. A fierce disagreement erupted between the 2 editors over how to describe the Jewish victims. Grossman wanted to minimize the use of the word Jew and to replace it with the word people. Ehrenberg vehemently objected. It's meaningless to talk about people being forced to wear an armband, people being taken to the market or the ghetto, without saying the word Jew. It just didn't make sense. And when Ehrenberg found that he was not being consulted on major decisions, he resigned from the editorial board of the Black Book. A watchdog editorial board, including Grossman, carefully concealed the specifically anti-Jewish character of the atrocities and downplayed the role of Ukrainians who worked as Nazi police officers. A first edition of, and this is the full title, The Black Book, The Ruthless Murder of Jews by Fascist German Invaders Throughout the Temporarily Occupied Regions of the Soviet Union and in the Extermination Camps of Poland during the War of 1941 to 1945, to give it its full title, was partially printed in the Soviet Union by the Yiddish publisher, the Emes. Emes, of course, is Emet, means the truth, and if we're in the Soviet Union, then we can be sure that anything called Emes is anything but. But they did, this was the first publication. However, Realpolitik was changing the atmosphere in Russia. As the Allied victory of 1945 morphed into the Cold War, the last thing that Stalin wanted was for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust to be remembered as a separate identity. Thus was born the Soviet practice of referring to murdered Jews as Soviet citizens, victims of fascism. It wasn't 33,771 Jews of Kiev who were shot in the ravine of Babi Yar. It was 33,771 Soviet citizens. Stalin ordered the destruction of the entire edition of the Black Book, the typefaces as well as the manuscript. But luckily, copies of the manuscript had already reached the United States, Romania, and British Mandatory Palestine. Excerpts were published in the United States in English under the title Black Book in 1946, and part of the manuscript was also published in Romania in 1947 with a foreword by Grossman. Supplemented by materials smuggled out of the Soviet Union in 1965 and 1970, it wasn't until 1980 that the Black Book was finally published in Russian. In Russian, but not in Russia. The Russian edition was published in Israel. Even before the fall of the Soviet Union, Ehrenberg's daughter Irina worked on recovering many lost texts that had been censored from the original manuscript. She did this for several years. She verified the accuracy of documents that had already appeared in earlier versions of the Black Book, and she even got her hands on items that had been hidden by the Grossman family, which is quite astonishing that they had hidden material that they didn't want in the book, but they hadn't destroyed it. Finally, 1993, post-USSR Vilnius, the Jewish publishing house Yad, Yad meaning hand, published in full the original galley proofs of the version that should have appeared 46 years earlier. This was the basis for this English edition. The complete black book of Russian Jewry. And it is credited, the editors are credited as Ilya Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman, because this was based on their very important research. The English version was published in 2002. And if you're asking, was there ever a Russian edition published in Russia? There was, last year. Let us return to the fate of the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee. There is no doubt that Michaels was deeply concerned with the desperate state in which so many Jews found themselves at the end of the war. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm of Michaels and others to help their Jewish brethren eclipsed whatever caution they had learned in the turbulent Stalinist purges of the 1930s, when Jewish individuals and groups treated the committee as a sorting house for Jewish complaints. The committee sent a complaint to Molotov, then deputy chair of the Council of People's Commissars, about discrimination in the allocation of aid to displaced persons. Allow me to make a short detour. Molotov had a Yiddish-speaking Jewish wife called Polina, who had a sister in Palestine and a brother in the USA, which was enough, of course, to make Stalin absolutely hate this woman, and he tried to persuade Molotov to divorce her. He tried to have her tried for espionage. Polina was an active supporter of the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee and befriended many of the leading members, most notably Michaels, the chairman. We'll come back to Polina in a minute. When Ehrenberg stated publicly that the committee had to combat anti-Semitism within the Soviet Union, his words were faithfully relayed by Pfeffer the Stinker. That's Stinker means somebody who tells tales, that's a Yiddish word. The resident mole, to Suslov. Some of you may remember that name from the Cold War. At the time he was head of the Foreign Policy Department of the Central Committee Secretariat. Later he became the chief USSR ideologue. Suslov told Stalin that the continued existence of the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee was, I quote, inappropriate and politically harmful. The growing anti-Semitism at the highest level of Stalin's regime during the immediate post-war years is a matter of public record. But we've not mentioned the elephant in the room. Can anyone guess what elephant I am referring to?
Lazar Moseyevich Kaganovich.
No? Another guess? Anyone? What elephant, what have I not mentioned about the immediate years after the end of the war? Go on, have a go. Thank you, Michael. I refer, of course, to the establishment in May 1948 of the State of Israel, which was immediately recognized by Stalin. Word of the birth of the Zionist entity spread like wildfire among the Jews of the Soviet Union. And those modern commentators who suggest that the Jewish identity of Soviet Jews was awakened only after the 1967 Six-Day War do not know what they are talking about. Itzik Pfeffer, the mole, described the difficulties experienced by the committee members when the State of Israel was declared. He says, Dozens of people came to us daily. We had to stay here all the time and explain to people exactly what the State of Israel was and how it portrayed itself. Letters poured into the committee from all over the Soviet Union, from ordinary people, party members, war veterans, and such public figures as chess champion Mikhail Botvinnik. The names and addresses of all the letter writers were, of course, duly forwarded to the authorities. The crisis came when Pravda received a letter from 500 Jews in a place called Jewry, asking the Soviet government to allow all the Jews of Jewry, I quote, to go to our homeland to create a large Jewish democratic state. 4 months after Stalin recognized the State of Israel, on the 10th of September 1948, Israel's first ambassador to the USSR, name Golda Meir, yes, presented her credentials at the Kremlin. And who do you think acted as interpreter between, by now, Foreign Minister Molotov and Golda? Yes, Molotov's Yiddish-speaking wife, Paulina, who became a good friend of Golda Meir. Golda later wrote about her concerns as she headed for the synagogue on her first Shabbat in Moscow, and I quote, "What had remained of their Jewishness after so many years of life under a regime that proclaimed a war specifically against Judaism?" Golda needn't have worried. She was greeted by 2,000 Jews on the Friday night, waving banners proclaiming in Hebrew, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people lives. But when Golda returned to the synagogue a few days later on Erev Rosh Hashanah for the high holiday services, 50,000 Jews were waiting for her. An emotional Golda addressed the crowd in Yiddish. A Dank euch was ihr seid geblieben Jiden. Thank you for having remained Jews. The sheer volume of the crowds that greeted Golda seems to have been the trigger in persuading Stalin to punish the Zionists, the ruthless cosmopolitans, as the euphemism was for Jews, and specifically the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee. 2 months after Golda's Rosh Hashanah synagogue outing, November 1948, Stalin had 13 members of the committee arrested on suspicion of espionage, treason, counter-revolutionary crimes, and organized action aimed at toppling the Soviet Union. The indictment asserted that the accused had been enemies of the government prior to their involvement with the committee, and that the committee served as their international network for communicating anti-Soviet views. In December 1948, Paulina Molotov was also arrested for treason, forced to divorce her husband, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. Paulina was lucky. Upon her release immediately after Stalin's death, she was reunited with her husband, and they remained unrepentant Stalinists for the rest of their lives. Paulina's friends on the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee were not so lucky. Between 1948 and 1951, the 13 Jews were tortured, beaten, and isolated before they were even formally charged. The torture led to false confessions, with one defendant telling the court, "I was ready to confess I was the Pope's own nephew." Almost 4 years after their arrest, the 13 members of the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee were executed in the Lubyanka prison on August the 12th, 1952, known to posterity as the Night of the Murdered Poets. In Yiddish, Harugei Malchus Funum Rattenverband. Not a single reference to the secret trial or the execution appeared in the Soviet media, and it was several years before the defendants' families learnt of the fates of their victims. Many other members of the committee were shot or died in prison camps. A few months after the Night of the Murdered Poets, in early 1953, Stalin accused a group of prominent Jewish Moscow doctors of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders, the so-called Doctors' Plot. There was a fierce anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist barrage in the media, and many Jewish doctors and officials were dismissed from their jobs and arrested. Thankfully, Stalin chose this moment to die. Within weeks, the new Soviet leadership dropped all charges regarding the Doctors' Plot from lack of evidence. And soon after the Doctors' Plot was declared to have been fabricated, there were demands to re-examine the torture-induced testimony at the trial of the Jewish Anti Fascist Committee defendants. In November 1955, the Soviet Supreme Court determined that there was, I quote, no substance to the charges against the 13 murdered defendants, and they closed the case. Many of the surviving committee members emigrated to Israel in the 1970s. To conclude, I want to follow the fate of the 4 prominent members of the committee with whom we began this talk. The committee chairman, the Yiddish actor Shlomo Michaels, was the most visible of the intellectual Jewish leadership. A show trial would have cast aspersions on Stalin's role. So in January 1948, he was assassinated on Stalin's personal orders while visiting Minsk. His death was disguised as a hit-and-run car accident, and in typical Soviet cynical fashion, Stalin gave Michaels a state funeral attended by 10,000 people. Michaels was officially rehabilitated in 1963. Although Vice Chairman Yanky Fachler was an informer for the Ministry of Internal Affairs, he too was arrested and thrown into jail for 3 years awaiting trial. During Pfeffer's pre-trial incarceration, Paul Robeson, who had befriended Pfeffer when Pfeffer was visiting the USA, came to Russia on a concert tour. Robeson asked to see his friend Pfeffer. So Stalin's police brought Pfeffer out of prison, put him in the care of doctors, and when he looked sufficiently healthy, he was brought to Moscow to meet Robeson. Pfeffer knew they were being bugged. He drew his finger across his throat and motioned with his eyes and lips, "They're going to kill us. When you return to America, you must speak out and save us." Pfeffer was executed along with all the other defendants on the Night of the Murdered Poets. He was officially rehabilitated in 1955. That leaves us with Grossman and Ehrenberg, the editors of the Black Book. Of the two, Grossman's career suffered most. In 1953, he was savaged in a Pravda article. As a Jew, Holocaust writer and internationalist, Grossman made an easy target. His works were no longer published, and by the end of his life, Grossman came to embrace a view of the Soviet system nearly as bitter as his condemnation of Nazism. He died in 1964, and it wasn't until 1988 that the Russian authorities lifted the ban on publication of his work. Ehrenberg, the great survivor, managed to retain his status as a prominent Soviet man of letters. 1952, he was awarded the Stalin Peace Prize. 1962, his memoirs, People, Years, Life, were published. In his book, Ehrenberg felt the need to explain his silence during the Purge trials in Moscow. Publicly, Ehrenberg's support for the Soviet state never wavered. In keeping with official Soviet policy, he publicly criticized Israel and Zionism, and for this, Golda Meir criticized him vehemently in her own memoirs. He died in 1967. His Moscow gravestone is adorned with a reproduction of his portrait drawn by his friend Pablo Picasso. But 20 years after Ehrenberg's death, he dropped a posthumous bombshell. Soviet experts were stunned to discover that in one of his last acts before he died, he secretly arranged for the transfer of his entire private archives. And where did he send his papers to? To Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in the capital city of the Zionist entity in Jerusalem. This discovery led to a belated reassessment of Ehrenberg's tightrope act under Stalin. And whatever this highly influential figure of the Stalinist regime may have said for public consumption, he clearly remained a proud Jew, a proud opponent of anti-Semitism, and a proud Zionist. And he made sure that his legacy became the property of the Zionist Jewish state. My friends, as a rule, I am scrupulous in my history talks to remain a historian and not a commentator on current affairs. Today, I will make an exception. As we saw, Stalin had serious problems with the Jews. Stalin's dedicated disciple, Red Ken Livingstone, is experiencing similar difficulties. Last week, I participated in the Irish Times weekly news podcast on the subject of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The vile language spouted by the anti-Israel participant in the podcast is indicative of the attack on Zionism across the world. I would like to offer a word of advice to the anti-Zionists of this world. Please allow the Jews themselves to define Zionism. A Zionist is someone who recognizes the right of the Jews to return to their ancient home after 2,000 years of persecution and wandering. As Ireland's former Chief Rabbi Mervis wrote last week in the Daily Telegraph, open a Jewish prayer book anywhere in the world, and Zionism will leap out from every page. He continued, anyone who declares themselves anti-Zionist is insulting every Jew in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the short-lived Jewish Anti Fascist Committee was undoubtedly a cynical tool in the hands of the monster Stalin. But the committee did have one tangible result: the material gathered for the Black Book. And anyone reading it will, I'm sure, as I was, be moved to their core in what is written here. What makes this book unique is that long before Holocaust literature came into the public domain, this was actually the first of its kind, because the material here was collected from 1943 onwards. When Grossman was writing about Treblinka, he'd never heard of Auschwitz. It's like incredible that they were following the trail of the murders almost in real time. And that's what is collected here. It is very difficult to read. I can warn you that. But I think it's a must. It's an area that we don't know about because we're very familiar with Poland and what happened there. We're very unfamiliar with what happened on Soviet soil, and here is the proof of it. Thank you very much.